Greetings, folks. Philip Bateman here, and welcome to this edition of Smarter Impact. I help CEOs and boards with strategy, attention, and investment. So if that's you and it's something you're seeking to improve, do get in touch. And it's my great pleasure to be here with Blair Palese, who's the Director of Philanthropy for Ethinvest, who's one of Australia's oldest impact advisors. She's the Managing Editor of Climate and Capital Media, and she's the founder of the Climate Capital Forum. Blair, it's a real pleasure to be speaking to you today.
Thank you so much.
Niceties aside, you're an absolute badass for just getting out there and having opinions and delivering and being the all swearing, all force for change. And how does
I
that
used to live I used to live in New York, so it's hard to break the swearing habit. But yeah, and look, I think one maybe nice thing about people who are your listeners and yourself is at some point you get to a point in your career you're just trying to have impact. And I pretty much get up every day and think how I can make a difference and look for gaps of things that aren't being done. And that's how I've kind of jumped into these three roles. And hopefully, it's having impact after 40 odd years in the pretty much the not-for-profit, also, climate and environment space with governments and with companies. You learn a few things along the way.
Mm. And I mean, our conversation today was going to be framed around fighting disinformation and renewable energy, politics, Europe and North America, kind of all the things that keep our little big island obsessed in the media cycle. Though I was interested when you spoke to those different groups you work with, what do you think keeps these sort of people up at night? Like when they're tossing and turning in bed, what's the questions that they're trying to answer? And, we've got the renewable push
Yeah.
side, we've got the politicians on the other side, but what do you think it is that's getting them?
In terms of being able to succeed, I guess, or look at the challenges we face right now
Yeah,
and
kind
how
of
we deal with that.
just as humans in some way. I know everybody's
Mm,
political lean, but what do you think? Like when you're speaking to the people who are coming to you, like what are they really
mm,
sort of? There's somewhere between this existentialness of human
mm.
society and then the day-to-day kind of like, how do I
Do
self-actualize
something about it.
family?
Right. Most definitely climate change is a driver, even if people are somewhat skeptical
Mm,
about how fast or how it's being produced. You cannot ignore the impact of extreme weather that's happening all over the world. Incredible heat here. It's incredible cold at the moment, which is what
mm,
was predicted by experts. How do you solve a problem that's that huge without, for instance, destabilizing your economy or keep your company going and being profitable? And then, disinformation is a kind of a whole new terrifying
mm,
anti-democratic force that I think most of us feel like we have no control over or very few ideas about what we can do about it. Those two things together, I think, are what I hear the most about when I talk to all levels of people, either our investing clients or NGOs we work and support closely. Also media, just scanning the kind of global media to see where the focus is. I think anybody with an eye to the future, whether you have kids and grandkids or whether you're just worried about what kind of planet you're leaving the next generation,
mm.
you can't kind of hide from these two things.
Yeah. And in relation to disinformation and the media and the movement of these things, um, often stuff is a little buried, like the real things that are going on. For me, I've always had this idea of, the good news. I meet people and NGOs and leaders, and they're just doing this amazing stuff. And I don't hear that good news in our media
Mm.
cycles. What are some of the things you think we don't know that people should?
Good question. And so true. I mean, there are actually some good news sources out there, but you really have to look for them. Certainly not coming through in the mainstream media a lot. Some better than others, I guess. But yeah, it's pretty dark time.
Mm,
But the best news of late is this study that happened just about 2 weeks ago. It reported in the Sydney Morning Herald and many other outlets globally that showed that while growth in the economy of China is going up, and also the rest of the world slightly. Now it's not a vast growth, but it's not a decline. We're seeing China's emissions in particular not only level but begin to go down.
mm,
And scientists believe this may be the turning point on climate because China is the biggest emission producer because it produces so much of the things we buy and use all the time. So when I say China's emissions are going down, what I mean is the world's emissions are leveling and going down. That is maybe something I didn't expect to see as someone who spends most waking hours looking at climate change as an issue.
mm,
I just didn't expect to see that good news come across at this stage. I thought it would take us another 10, maybe 20 years to start to get there, and that every year we spent waiting, we'd have greater impact. So, I guess that what to take away from that is we actually could solve climate change, which is something you're not going to hear people say often. Like, hand on heart, it's in our grasp that we could turn it around. And when you think about the size and scale of the change we're talking about, which is transforming not only our global energy systems, but our global economy that's been based on fossil fuels, those are pretty big things to be hopeful about if we really continue to roll up our sleeves and get to it.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I distinctly remember sitting in the energy summits with the Australia China Business Council about feels like about 8 years ago, and they had the
Mm.
guys from 5B there, who
Oh
are
yeah,
the national, or not the national, but the massive solar field we're building in the Northern Territory,
yeah.
undersea power cable to Singapore. And during that summit, there were these people charting the growth of the renewables in China and how much they were implementing. And I always remember looking at the trend line at the bottom of sort of like the base load of their coal generators that wasn't really going down. But what it
Mm.
didn't account for was this massive spike in energy,
Growth. Yeah,
and it all being taken up with hydro and renewables. And
yeah,
simply that they're installing the equivalent of 5 nuclear reactors worth of solar every fortnight.
yeah. Yeah,
Like,
it's about a gigawatt a day. If you can imagine that, China's
yeah.
installing about a gigawatt of renewable energy a day. It's phenomenal change and positive change. And granted, it's a country where it's easier to do that because of the nature of its government. It says it's going to do it and it does it. That's not as easy in a democracy like Australia or America or even India, where there are many other factors that play into decisions. But nonetheless, because of the size and the impact and the dependence we all have on
Mm.
China for so many things that we buy and use, it's a phenomenal positive step. So I take that to heart, and I, say don't give up yet. We really, and then, I guess
Yeah.
ultimately the question is, if we can solve this, what can't we solve? It's just such a scale of a challenge for us as a human race. To do it means we have the capacity to work together and solve all kinds of problems. So that's pretty inspiring. And yet more than ever, let's double down and keep to it, and not be sidetracked by distractions. Because I think we look at the kind of the nonsense of a nuclear debate in Australia,
Mm.
and you can't not say it's just not. It makes zero sense economically, let alone from an energy time point of view, but also a risk point of view.
Mm.
Simply doesn't make sense. And many similar things are being not accidentally put out in the world to kind of distract us and allow fossil fuels to continue. And we just can't let that happen, or we won't meet that goal.
And I'm gonna weave around the questions I have here, because I was having a look at your Twitter account or X account, and you've been like 70,000 posts, so you've been
Sorry about that.
no, I didn't go that far back. I didn't go that far back, but I saw White Dudes for Harris for, yeah, which
White
was
dudes for
awesome.
her, mostly because it was funny.
Yeah. And just a variety. And so when I think about disinformation and the social space, the public commons, if you will, and discourse, like when I saw that meme about, uh the 5 power stations worth of renewables being installed every fortnight. It's a simple thing. And in
Mm,
your feed, you had about Woodside drilling off. It was a reshare about Woodside drilling offshore into the Barrier Reef, exporting all of the gas, our common wealth, having no tax on
mm.
it whatsoever. That kind of stuff drives me crazy. And at the same time, in Europe, they're developing overriding public interest laws because they're
Mm,
and saying, well, we're just going to assume that renewables are in the public interest. Like
right.
it's a framework, it's a regulatory framework. Um, and this is a prompt from Tim Buckley in the background because I had a chat
Mm.
about this conversation we were going to have. So thanks, Tim, for these little prompts. And what's your take on our adopting that mechanism or having something like
Mm.
writing public interest?
Really good question. I find in Australia there's a real, well, for many reasons, we've kind of lost that appreciation of public interest as a whole, whether it's legally, the right to protest, things like, we've kind of, and the decisions taken around things like ownership of public assets, for instance.
Mm.
The right and often the business sector has lobbied hard against that, when in fact, even for a strong economy, it makes sense for some things for there to be an underlying appreciation that some things, healthcare, for instance,
Mm.
there is a public interest factor. One of the things I love most about Australia is our ability to get healthcare and an appreciation that it doesn't just help me that I get healthcare. It's that my entire community has access to healthcare, including mental health care,
Mm.
which when I lived in the States and went to university in New York City, under the years of Ronald Reagan, that's how far I go back, literally ending any funding for mental health facilities meant dumping mentally ill health patients out on the streets of the city. It was dangerous to walk around the city any time of the day and night because there were people who had no access to medication or care with diseases like schizophrenia who could become quite violent. You are consciously aware of it all the time. So when people think about healthcare, often they do get that underlying sense of the importance of public interest in Australia, but they often don't connect that with things like the energy transition and why that will build a strong economy that gives us more energy diversity and security, but also gives us control over prices. I mean, at the moment, the cost of living crisis in Australia is heavily, heavily impacted by the incredible cost of gas, which we buy back from companies that have, develop, drill it out and take it out here, produce it, send it offshore. We're buying it back at incredible cost. That's just insane, right? And
It's
no other
just
country in the world is doing that with its own resources.
yeah, and without
Kind
having
of
any taxation
heartbreaking,
without any
right? No tax,
there's no
and also no kind of agreement that some of that has to stay here for our own population, because after all, it's our resource.
sour gas.
Anyway,
It's the
complex,
Commonwealth. That's what,
right?
yeah.
Exactly. But, so it does take us kind of, particularly if your profit motive is, successful companies,
Mm.
to stop and think about what you need first in a country to build a strong country and society and economy. And that is that idea of, public interest for, we really have to consider what aspects of that are essential, healthcare being one of them. But I think resources are another, and things like public interest law, where people have the right to challenge things because and protest, because some of the best outcomes we've seen throughout history in any country in the world have happened because of those two things, where individuals, communities, or groups have challenged a wrongdoing, something that's blatantly wrong, and the only way to change it really was to start a movement, if you will, to say we're going to find ways to change that. That's certainly the case with climate change, because fossil fuels will, like tobacco, be dragged kicking and screaming to the end of a production of a material that is killing the planet now. 120 years ago was great, right? It was fueling the industrial economy of the world. We've recognized 50 years ago, at least, or more, that the more we collect fossil fuels and carbon emissions in the atmosphere, the more danger we create to a heating planet. And we're seeing that play out. So now that we know that, it's time to change. You're going to have to make difficult changes. I am always inspired by Europe's ability to look at problems, just go at finding solutions and get on with it, without the kind of debates that happen corporately run, sponsored, and funded kind of misinformation, disinformation that we see in places like the US and in Australia to try and prevent that change happening. When in fact, they have every opportunity as smart companies to make the transition and become profitable in the brave new world that is renewable energy and battery storage, and a range of other things that offer incredible opportunities economically.
In some ways, if we look at the population variation in size between Europe and Australia, and then we think of the profit motive of corporates and the small population we have here, and the not the drain, but the draw to higher wages in the private sector, and then the way regulation or the government have really just nestled within that. We're an industrial nation, so the
Sure.
regulation arguably there to enable the industrialization from day dot.
Yeah.
And we
Yep.
have a hard civic class of people who see civic duty and being in government as something you would do because you exist. It's more like, we'll leave the people in the crater to figure it out. Like, why would you go and be a politician?
Yeah.
some
And
regards.
I think, showing my political stripes here, but
Mm.
community independents are an alternative to that capture, if you will.
Yeah.
They're not in a two-party system that was captured a long time ago by that thinking about first priority making money for corporates,
Mm.
whether they're paying tax, ergo, paying their salary or not. In this case, not. But that rise of community independence has very much come about because people are frustrated with that capture of the two-party system, in our case, the three, if you count the nationals. And they want something that's different, that represents their communities and their electorate's interests. And they very much felt that they were not being represented. And we saw 7 get in, new community independents, and a control of the balance of power in the Senate, which is pretty dramatic.
Yeah.
And I know that I watch the outcome of those 7 plus the additional independents in that are elected into Senate and Parliament. But it's remarkable what they're doing. They're talking about integrity. They're talking about media independence. They're talking about how
Truth
we
and
do
political
deal with,
advertising laws.
right, and disinformation and the impact on children, access to online pornography
Mm.
for children. Things that have not been on the agenda politically of this country for a very long time. They're pushing tax reform, right? Imagine that being sexy. In
Yeah.
my electorate of Wentworth, tax reform is a Labour spender's key issue
Mm.
because it's outdated. It's truly outdated. And
Yeah.
actually part of our Climate Capital Forum push is that reform needed to remove, for instance, fossil fuel subsidies that lock in. Just tell you an amazing story that I heard yesterday, which is from Tim Buckley, who, by the way, I confess, is in our forum. So, we spend a lot of time together.
Yeah.
But imagine developing countries like South America, where BHP has already electrified its entire large-scale mining fleet.
Mm.
Or why? Because it makes sense and it's cheaper. But hey, why haven't they done it in Australia? Because of a fossil fuel subsidy
Is
that
it
doesn't
diesel
make
fuel
it cost
subsidy?
effective for
Yeah,
them. Right,
totally. Yeah.
insane, right? We want them to electrify their fleet. And in fact, it's holding them back as a company
Yeah.
to be a leader in this aspect of
And
electrification.
a wild thing is I've
So,
been in Brisbane with one of the largest industrial manufacturers of mining equipment working on their self-driving autonomous
mm,
underground mining trucks who are fully electric. So we make
right.
it here.
Yeah,
Like
we're making it
we
here.
make it in the country.
We
Like
guess
it's
what? We don't make a lot of diesel, but we're importing it so that BHP can use it in its trucks here, but not in
yeah.
Peru where they've
And,
electrified
and we're
completely.
importing really horrible low quality diesel that burns at
Yeah,
low emission.
terrible.
Because I don't know if people
Yeah, and so constant reform is key, right? And you're not necessarily going to get that necessarily governance that you need as a country
Mm.
if your political parties have been captured. And I will say that Labor's Future Made in Australia Act is a great attempt to
Mm.
kind of follow in the lead of the US IRA to
Yeah.
look for what makes sense here in terms of legislation that can help us do that electrification better, renewable energy and battery storage better, encourage the kind of reforms we need tax-wise to, for instance, keep some manufacturing here,
Mm.
make it investment ready for Australians to invest here, not overseas, if you want to be invested in climate solutions. So it's a start, and it's a good start. We got to get it over the line, but it's just the start. We have much more ambitious things we should be doing as an economy, and that takes a government that isn't captured. So
Mm.
I am all for more community independence because I think they literally look at every issue with their electorate's concerns and what they want at heart, and that's what government should be at its core.
Mm. Yeah, I was very pleased to convene a session of Smarter Impact with Monique Ryan, Nicolette Bell, Julian Schultz,
Mm,
Jessica O'Connor. I called it the Heart of the Nation or Soul of the Nation prior to the last election
yeah,
cycle. Um,
fantastic.
I really hope Nicolette gets in this year again.
Yes, she is an old friend. In fact, one of the
Yeah.
first people I met when I moved to Australia. I used to work with her brother, believe it or not. It's a very small world. But I help her when I can, in any way I can, and a donor.
Mm.
She is an outstanding example of what we want in government. She has worked in um, every kind of aspect, like responsible investment, which gives you a perspective about that challenge of keeping good investment in Australia.
Mm.
Renewable energy sector, within government, we work together at the Sustainable Energy Development Authority. So I'm the kind of person you want with a kind of an amazing career background that would be the perfect kind of skill set you want in government,
Mm.
not a career politician. All for bringing people with expertise in and not people who've spent 30 years in a political party, and that's what they know best.
Yeah.
And Monique Ryan's another great example of that, coming with a medical background and at the highest level,
Mm.
just one of the best and brightest and smartest, one of our kind of medical professionals and research professionals. She just brings a whole different mindset and set of skills to government, and more of that, I say, and less of a career politician whose
Yeah.
only focus has been working within their political party
It does amaze me that people are in charge of things of
without experience.
have domain expertise in. They're like, well, I rely
Yeah.
on my people to inform me, and then I make choices. I'm like, yeah, but what's it based on? What do you like?
Yeah. And where's your hands-on experience? And, as much as, I spend a lot of time in Canberra talking to people about all these things that we're talking about, and with the forum, Climate Capital Forum in mind. Still 400 fossil fuel lobbyists in Canberra every day, and virtually I know one lobbyist for the emerging clean tech sector,
Yeah.
which will be the future economy of this country, and where we want our kids to be working, and where we want to invest, right? And because we want to be at the cutting edge of that emerging global market. But we're not going to do that with 400 fossil fuel lobbyists whispering in the ear of captured government officials. But I was just say the other artificially weird thing about Canberra, people live there during the entire sitting of. I'm not saying they don't go home to their electorates and meet with their own electorate,
Yeah.
but it's a weird world where you get in your car in the morning and you park under Parliament House. You have zero touch with real people facing difficult challenges like paying their bills and affordability of housing and food, and they just live in a world where in Canberra where you just don't see it, you don't interact with it. You can't get on the train in Western Sydney or in Melbourne or in Brisbane and not see people that are struggling every day with the simple aspects of dealing with life, getting their kids clothed and fed, finding access to good schools, all those things that should be driving how government thinks and works. But I feel like it's one of the, even having lived in DC, Washington, you have that, you see it, you can't escape it. In
Yeah.
Canberra you really do, and it's an artificial world that worries me for Australia. It's just not, I think, in touch with normal people living out every day that you are in there to try and support as main priority.
Mm. So autocracies can get things done. And if the autocracy belonged to Blair, what would you do?
Well, that's a very good question. In a funny way, I would put term limits on government officials so that they couldn't become captured. I wouldn't, take over the government and make it all my way. I would find the best ways to protect the democracy that we have currently, but that needs improvements to ensure it survives things like disinformation. And I'd find ways to ensure those smart people we're talking about who have incredible experiences and careers do see the calling to government as something they might do for 4 years,
Mm.
because I think we'd be all the better for it. And the other thing I see constantly as an issue in the States, and here is in the US, it's the Constitution, here it's many of our existing laws. They need to be regularly updated because things change a lot. Disinformation and the kind of challenge we see in a world of shrinking independent media
Mm.
is something you couldn't have really imagined 100 years ago or 60 years ago or even potentially 25 years ago. So government has to keep up with that. I think one key thing I would do is every, say, 10 or 12 years, we have to reconsider, stop everything, and think about what has to change right now. Don't keep rolling on with what you have. And in the US, the Constitution was very much written by founding fathers, only fathers. So a case in point, right? No women involved, no younger people involved, certainly no people of ethnic diversity involved. That world has changed, and yet that Constitution was written by English white men who came to America.
Mm.
It was meant to be rewritten, and it's
Yeah.
never been rewritten. So
Mm.
gun laws, insane, right? Why doesn't America have gun laws? Because people are hanging on something in a constitution that was written, well over 200 years ago that no longer applies. The right to bear arms is an
Yeah.
insane idea in a modern society.
Yeah.
And yet you've got open carry gun laws in states in the South where people are literally getting on a bus with a gun strapped around their,
I
their chest.
distinctly
It's
drove it.
insane.
Yeah, I went into Oregon and somebody said, "Oh, don't get out and pump the gas." And I went, "What do you mean?" They're like, "It's illegal to pump your gas in Oregon." And I went, "But I could have an AK-47 slung over my shoulder." They're like, "Oh yeah, you can open carry, just can't pump your gas." So that I don't mean to diminish the discussion there because that was just a silly.
No, but it's a great case in point, right? We have to update our laws to be relevant to the time we're in. That'd be the second thing I'd do. So term limits and that, we have to revisit government and what our priorities are. And here's a crazy idea that works really well over in Europe. Once again, always kind of leading in this, interestingly, in a kind of got democracy, but it's definitely got a public interest driver at the core of their society, is this idea of citizens' juries. So where people are asked to get involved and help make decisions about big issues. They come to it with no expertise. They spend a significant amount of time learning about the issue, one specific issue, and then they make recommendations to the government about what should be done. Disinformation is a perfect case in point. This works not only really well as a something you do to see how it goes, but in many countries in Europe, it's required that the government then enacts what this group of the public does and delivers by way of recommendation. So it's mandated. So you don't. So I was part of two of them in Australia, the first one and the second as the writer for the group. So my job was to help them end up with a document of those recommendations as a writer. My background's communications, and this was 1999, maybe, a long time ago. When this group put in unbelievable amounts of themselves into this process, they took it very seriously. Their recommendations were outstanding. And they handed it to a government official in Canberra who said, "I look forward to putting this on the library shelf." I kid you not. "I'm going to enter this into the archive," was the gist, as in, we don't care. We're not listening to what you had to say. The look on the faces of the group of, say, 30 people from all around the country who'd put in 4 months of their lives into a process to take this seriously and make the recommendations was gutting. I mean, it's their confidence dropped, and they had grown in confidence as citizens to be asked and to value their opinion through this process, only for the representative who received it to literally just kind of, pull the rug out from under them and say, "We don't really care." Whereas in Europe, they have to take those recommendations seriously. So even the process of these regular citizens' juries and the responsibility that people take up to be part of it has an incredible impact societally, that they're being listened to and they're being taken seriously. So that would be my third thing. I would install citizens' juries on 12 to 15 issues a year to help government make, to represent that public interest and an outcome that is, as far as I know, almost everyone that I've looked at has taken it seriously enough to put that public interest at the center of the decisions and the recommendations they make.
So, in my experience of seeing groups that are doing grassroots movements to create political change, a big advocate for that is creating kitchen table conversations. I mean, it's big. I think I've got Kathy Goes to Canberra.
Canberra.
Kathy Goes to
Yeah.
Canberra on the shelf. And then having seen that done across North America and things and throughout Europe, it's this idea, a people movement, like the current US election, coming up, the people versus the individual in most respects. And the idea that the citizens have agency when it rises up, it's very apparent citizens have a lot of agency. I'd like to take that to disinformation now, because truth is based on experience and values. So you're going to have a wild truth associated. When the average person hears about disinformation, I think the term only sort of came into popular nuance during the COVID years, when suddenly people were like, "Oh, what is disinformation?" Though I feel like I've been tracking it in a hyper way since the start of almost the Iraq War, if I go back.
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense.
And then Scott Morrison's re-election campaigns. I think that's the first time Australia really saw Reagan-esque hard
tactics.
good versus bad, amped up through robots and digitized, and then with fake profiles used to simply poison the well, if you will, from a discussion perspective. How do you think people react in general to the idea of disinformation, and how would you frame it as a subject or a mechanism or a pervasive evil that's destroying our lives?
Yeah, I guess it's a post-truth, post-science world where that there's really have gotten to the point where people are honestly saying, is there truth, and is science accurate? And that's dangerous. When it comes to solving real problems in the world, we need to believe and to understand that there are proven aspects of things that are happening.
Hmm.
For instance, emissions in the atmosphere causing a warming of the planet that is essentially threatening our existence. That's real, right? And I think one of the biggest challenges for people who are not scientists to understand is science is never finished. So the best we can do is take scientists and scientific best expert opinion right now and know that things may come along and change that, but that doesn't diminish what we know right now. A lot of people have put a lot of time into, for instance, finding cures for diseases, or recognizing what the trigger points are to show us why climate impact is happening right now.
And
Um,
it
I,
also doesn't mean that the current bit we're pushing on
yeah,
invalidates everything below it in the stack, or
exactly.
because physics is still a thing. It's like,
Right, exactly. Yeah, basic things we figured out thousands of years ago, still relevant today,
hmm,
and important that we build on that. So I think that's a key thing about truth and science that we need to understand that is being undermined by both dis and misinformation. So what's the difference? Disinformation is an active campaign to spread chaos through making things up and getting people to believe things that are not true and then act on them. Anti-vaccine stuff was probably the most blatant example of that. We had people throwing out all kinds of crazy notions and ideas about vaccines, to make people say, I don't want them. And you can see the impact of things like polio, where that's had such an impact in Pacific Island communities that there's now a new outbreak of polio where it was literally wiped out. And people are actively doing that. What's motivating that? Well, some terrifying things, I assume. But misinformation is that kind of, well, it's just confusing. We don't know about this. It may not be an active campaign. It may be more spinning something that could be true or maybe isn't true. And also it counters what we probably know is more likely to be true. But both together are a terrifying impact. And I think it is starting to impact everything we do. And the use of, it's not just the information or lack of, but it's how trolls are being used, how algorithms and social media and online are being used. And in fact, really often missed out is the diminishing aspect of an independent media. We just have watched over the last 50 years, mostly because of free online stuff, that it's almost commercially unviable for media to exist in the way that it did as when I was growing up, which was there were sources of media and their job was to just impartially tell you news about key issues and activities going on in the world. That is shrinking at an alarming rate. In Australia, it's maybe more alarming, I believe, than anywhere else in the developed world. Having one owner that is Murdoch, which in my mind, if you really define it as more propaganda than it is media, I mean, it's a dangerous propaganda source.
hmm,
If you think that's your sole information source, it has an agenda. It is coming at every story with an agenda, and you see it in, all you have to do is watch Fox News in America to know what that agenda is. And to pretend that that agenda is not also in our print Murdoch media is fooling ourselves. It is absolutely there. It's a little more subtle.
hmm.
That's absolutely there. And the tactics they use are dangerous and worrying when it comes to that dependence we all had on media as an independent source of information. So
Yeah.
I think that's a worry. I worry about the ABC having been shifted with a clear mandate to try and stack the board with people of on the right and that are more linked to that propaganda agenda.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know how to solve that problem. I don't know how we solve the problem of a diminishing commercially viable independent media, except it does bring us back to that question of public interest. Do we, for instance, we do have a public interest source, which is ABC, as well as and radio and online print, online, written news from the ABC and SBS, and we pay for that, right? But what we don't have in place are assurances to make sure it remains independent.
Hmm.
So I would say that's needed here. But you look at a country like the States, which has public broadcasting service is tiny. Somehow, the sheer size of the market, they've maintained some fantastic independent media sources, and they're still there as something people rely on.
Mm.
So I'd say it has to be made a priority. That public interest aspect of
I mean,
information,
in some
we have
ways,
to set that up.
I was going to say, in some ways, the population size as well, it gives rise to the fact that with a few key people who are relatively willing to chip in an amount of money, you can do a lot with
Mm,
media. It
true.
doesn't take a lot to get a story out and to spread information, whether it's, the other people consider it disinformation because it's factual or not is a simple thing.
Different issue, yeah.
Yeah. Having, essentially, I mean, I grew up as a journalist, watching journalism,
Mm,
like seeing the news and seeing documentaries and being like, this is great. I know fundamentally that emotion
yeah.
work better than facts. And that's why I have a business essentially. My work is sitting there and
Mm,
getting the facts out of people and then helping them share it in their voice in an emotional way because
yeah, so important.
the emotion. Um,
Yeah, because we are all human. We take our information in with that emotion as a key part of what, builds the trust of
yeah,
hearing the things you hear. And that echo chamber of what we're developing now through dis and misinformation is the worry, is that because it plays on that emotion,
yeah,
leaving out the facts, and it's easy to start heading down a, if you will, a kind of endless tunnel of dis and misinformation
yeah.
and believe that it's true without a check of any kind.
And in some ways, it's the delivery mechanism. It's the
Mm.
syringe that's driving this into people because if
Yeah.
an algorithm doesn't have emotion and is purely seeking engagement, and therefore the most engaging things are the most emotive ones, and they don't have to be factually true, they just need to be socially approved by the fact that they're being
Mm.
shared and engaged with, and monkeys are driven.
True.
I can,
Yeah. Yeah, you've seen those photos of the mobile phone walls, right, where someone is sitting there programming trolls to interject into our information through that social media
I
network,
haven't,
and
but I'm
it's
going to go check
terrifying.
it out. Because, there are
Terrifying.
these really simple gates, if you will, to people's awareness. Like when I've put up pictures before, I'm like, have a look at every masthead of the Murdoch paper across the country during Dan Andrews' time during COVID for
Mm.
6 months. Like just
Personal attack.
look at them all as a
Personal
wall.
attack. Yeah.
Or here 5 or 6 media commentators across 6 different platforms, the morning show
Mm.
channels on 3 different stations, that will all say the same introductory sentence as a framing. I'm like,
Yes, it's absolutely organized. It is,
yeah,
and it was during the last election. I was a victim of that, accused of some outrageous things just because it's politically expedient, because I volunteered for my independent
mm,
in my electorate by the sitting Liberal member. You know, personal attacks of the most horrific kind for having a conscience and a concern about human rights issues. And I can tell you that that was orchestrated across 8 women in a volunteer in each of the independent seats. They literally spent hundreds of hours pouring electronically through our social media posts. As you said, I'm prolific on Twitter, to my detriment, perhaps, but it's and now less so. But at its core, it was an amazing free ability to communicate with
mm,
lots of people watching issues you cared about. Very smart people, a lot of great journalists were using it as a source, for instance, to find things happening internationally, and down to the second where the story would be written in a Murdoch press, it would instantly be on a shock jock radio program with the sitting member of the Liberal Party attacking me personally, a member of the public and a volunteer in a campaign, not someone who is running or actively involved,
yeah,
and being accused of something I am not, and
mm,
then spinning that for as long as it's politically expedient for them. That's dangerous stuff, right? And I can tell you right now, I've lived a career as a journalist, as a campaigner, as a spokesperson for issues, and I can take that. I work in the space where I'm often public.
mm,
Uh, but for many women who were first time volunteers for independence, who were politically attacked and accused of some horrific stuff,
yeah,
it's not so easy. And you see the impact of things like robo debt, where people are not strong enough to take that, and people end up dead. I kid you not.
Yeah.
Suicide becomes a real thing when stuff like that is thrown at people who aren't used to it, don't know how to cope, and don't have support mechanism around them to help them understand what's going on and not take it personally. So
Mm.
that's dangerous stuff to our political kind of landscape, and something we have to think long and hard about. I just want to mention too one thing in relation to all this that for your audience, maybe even more worrying to me. We started Climate and Capital Media out of New York in order to cover the issue, the opportunity side of climate change through the voices of experts and the trends of that through experts. Because we're seeing a diminishing business, honest, legitimate, and truth-based business media. So what a risk to our investors, to our economy. It's when Murdoch Media buys the Wall Street Journal. We have to worry about what economic information about the markets we're getting. Has that been altered? Is that disinformation, misinformation? Is it propaganda? Certainly, when it comes to the opportunity side of things like renewable energy, batteries, how fast clean tech is emerging as an opportunity, I'd say yes, we have to worry about that because we're not getting as much free information. Free in particular, Bloomberg is fantastic, but
Mm.
you have to pay for that. And so, for instance, if you're a smaller financial advisor, this is not your core focus area, but how and where do you get legitimate market information about how fast things are changing
Mm.
when maybe all that's free to you is a Murdoch source or a source that just not so sure if it's a legitimate market-based, expert-led outlet. So that's why we started Climate Capital Media. But I urge everyone to constantly question where they're getting their information about the economy and
Mm.
about the markets. Certainly, sure, you can look at the Dow, you can look at, but when you're looking at interpretive material about our economy and where good investments might be, you have to be very careful these days because those old days of opening up the Wall Street Journal and getting, and even the AFR in Australia for sure has had a bent. The departing editor in chief was an out in the open climate denier, 12, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So, that's dangerous. And there are motivators behind that and why that happens. Going back to that idea of being captured by, kind of fossil fuel industry and other related companies. So, anyway, so ask questions. There are some great sources still out there. I'm a great believer in the Financial Times and
Mm.
The Economist as excellent, but they're not solely focused on countering that disinformation.
Mm.
So we have to be really careful now to be asking questions about where we're getting information, and maybe getting a variety of different opinions, so that we're able to sort of see where the debate is, and think ourselves about what we believe is happening and how fast and how it impacts us.
Because I spend so much time hanging out with like growth stage companies and climate boards
Yeah,
like this and going to conferences, I've always got this real kind of like excited clip about the next thing that people are chipping away on. And then when I speak to people who aren't in those environments, they're reading papers and they're like basically
yeah,
thinking,
don't know it.
why am I going to have kids? I should go kill myself
Yeah,
because we're all burning in a fire. And in some ways that's kind of true, but they also don't understand that you can go and get a climate job. You can go and work
yeah,
with companies. There are
yeah. You can help this along. Yeah,
pouring money into this thing. Um,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
I remember being out at a maintenance company who does power stations out at Loy Yang like
Mm,
12 years ago. And the guy was sitting there being like, yeah, well, I mean, they've never maintained these things. So the cost to keep them online is huge. And they were end of life 10 years ago. So it's not like these things are ever going to be replaced and be good for the country, but they're just ticking away. And I was like, oh, that's a bit of a hidden fact. Do you ever talk to
mm,
people about that? He's like, oh no, 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 no. We just talk about how this has to be here and we can't go to renewables and it's not possible. And he goes, but we just get paid by all the power
yeah,
companies to do their maintenance. And it's just these layered
right.
contravention. And because I basically
Yeah.
get most of my information from I wouldn't say from YouTube, but like I get it in market. But then there's a whole lot of
Mm,
pundits and sort of new journalistic comedians who are politically orientated, like Friendly
yeah.
Jordies, and there's another guy called
Yeah.
um, Punt.
Hunter politics.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But they're these like sort of early 30s hilarious internet meme guys who are just saying absurd shit at the same time as weaving in really pointed
In
calling out
fact,
the political
yeah,
media.
which
And
you're not getting out of mainstream media.
yeah, we've gone from like Ray Martin and 60 Minutes to Friendly Geordies with the death
Yeah,
of independent media in the middle and the complete sole
yeah.
ownership of murderocracy across it all. And
Yeah,
I'm
it's
wondering,
a really challenging landscape, yeah.
yeah,
And if
how much
you're imagine you're 19 and you're trying to figure out the world, and whoa, it's even harder for you because you don't have the memory of what as we do of a real solid independent media where you've got your sources
yeah.
and information. And I just want to say one thing too on that information around the business and investment side. I went to a presentation by a investment firm and sat next to an older gentleman investor, retired now, but doing his own investments. And what do you think about uranium? And I was like, oh, terrifying, right? It's working for him. This idea that uranium and nuclear is going to become this vast solution to our energy problem. There isn't a single bit of information, legitimate market information, that would tell you it's a good bet for a million reasons. The cost, sheer cost of the. You compare building a nuclear reactor and let's be clear, there's not an existing commercially running small modular reactor anywhere in the world. So let's just move that aside because that's a lovely idea, but it's not going to happen as a practical thing in our lifetime. So moving that out, what we have is old, very antiquated technology reactors that are extremely expensive. Australia's never had one, so we'd be going from a cold start. And on top of that, it's about, well, do your by whatever times, 6, 8. I've seen 12 times more expensive than renewables and battery storage, which is easy, fast, deployable anywhere, diversified in what you use where. It just makes 100% sense, right? From a strictly market point of view.
Mm.
So here's someone sitting next to me reading and hearing conservative, what he wants to hear, what they want to tell him, uranium, which is a diversion from the speed at which we need to make the switch to renewables and battery storage, and a range of other efficiency, AI driven, effective ways to use energy down to the second. He's not hearing that, right? He's not hearing that.
Yeah, because is it generational thinking for the benefit of the public as a outcome of citizen juries and civic responsibility, or is it a political wedge issue to get an
The
opposition?
political wedge issue, absolutely.
And do
And
you have
but
a
if
media
you're
that
if
just
you're an
go, all right, I'll run it for
investor,
you?
if
Excuse
you're an
me?
investor, be worried, right? You're gonna have to look a lot harder. I recommend Renew Economy. Watch it every day. It's just
Yeah,
following the money
yeah.
and the success stories of who's breaking through and the companies that are pursuing the transition.
Yeah, I mean, I was at the
Um,
Global Wind and Energy Conference, and Corio Generation and Macquarie bought the UK Green
Gloria, amazing.
Bank, and the Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. They're not spending billions and billions of dollars on
They're not.
modular reactors because they don't exist,
No,
and they're
no.
not
And in fact,
plants in
let's
it.
face it, Europe is still rolling them back.
Yeah,
Sure, there've been due to the Ukraine and Russian situation a
yeah,
pause of, oh geez, we can't do that as fast as we want to. But the truth is, it just doesn't make cost sense.
yeah.
And you look at a company like 5B, and you should be excited, right?
Mhm.
SunDrive, be excited, right? Australia is still at the cutting edge of some of the best new technology and renewables in the world, including better than China.
Yeah.
Are we doing all we can to make the most out of that economically? Not even close. So, as a nation with a public interest in mind, let's look at this stuff as our big opportunity because it is.
And is that because the new economy is collaborative and not competitive?
I love that. And I think it is collaborative and less competitive. It's not to say people won't make money,
Mm,
but I think what works to make money in this new economy of the low carbon world is you can't be successful with it collaborating across the supply chain
mm,
and potentially with other countries who produce parts of that supply chain that you're not going to produce in your own country. That's true in the States, that's true in Australia. So that collaboration piece is important, but also great. It's a new, again, a more distributed thinking about how a company operates and less monolithically top down, if you will. There'll be thousands and thousands of successful companies in this new clean tech world. And That's exciting, and that's more opportunity to work in it, invest in it. Have it here in Australia, small market, because we have unique things that are great here. We have the world's most incredible amount of rare earth minerals. We have the smarts to build circular battery whole systems that will recycle, and we'll just use them over and over again. Incredible. We have smarts in IT and technology, quantum, etc. I'm not all for going to the US to do partnerships on quantum. We have that right here. Let's use our own smarts from a national security point of view, as well as from a leg up our own economic point of view. Let's get smart about making Australia our priority economically. And I still think we're lagging behind, thinking we're not good enough. We are 100% good enough, and we just have to support our own and get them into a position where they can be in the market globally and doing what we do best, which is the smart side of it, not the kind of labor side of it. We should become the Scandinavia of the Southern Hemisphere, and build the systems and how we work it in, and then we should be exporting that lower carbon alternative to things like iron ore and steel. We have every ability to do that stuff, but we got to get behind it.
Yeah, and props to the marketing department of the government who came up with the Future Made in Australia Act.
I know, right?
Pretty much says it all.
That's what it is.
That was a
That
clear
says it
home
all.
run, that one. Something you changed your mind about in the last 6 months?
Oh, it's a really great question. I change my mind all the time. And again, one of the challenges of our post-truth world is people getting attacked for changing their mind. Don't do that. Changing your mind means you've got a brain in your head and you're using it as the world changes. We have to be able to support people changing their mind. I'd say the thing I changed my mind about was that America, it was over. Honestly, about 6, 7 weeks ago, I thought Trump was in, and it's it. They're going to rip out every bit of the U.S. IRA that is transforming their economy,
Yeah,
and bringing back manufacturing that looked impossible 5 years ago. They're going to rip that out, and
making it do
right, and they're going to go back to fascism. Quite frankly, Trump has a fascist platform. If you haven't seen that document, I recommend you just have a dive into the reports on what's in that thing. It is the destruction of their democracy in every clear and very directive way. So given that, I've changed my mind because, and if you want to get kind of creative about thinking about what just happened with Biden and Kamala Harris, is I think they planned it a good while back, and that delay tactic was to allow to have everything in place when he did step back and she did step up, which is just smart politics. When you're up against a Trump who will play every low ball game to win attention, without any content whatsoever,
left it late.
that's where I've changed my mind.
Yeah.
I have to tell you, if you're not excited about watching that transformation,
I
it's exciting.
Yeah, I took her initial speech in Wisconsin and stuck it up online because I'm like, look at this for speechcraft. Like it's just
Amazing.
it's a beautiful thing.
And to use freedom and that idea that what's at risk are rights and freedoms in this election, goes right to the core of what's been happening in the States, in the US media, in the Trumpian world. And it's resonating instantly. One word, the word freedom, what's at risk freedom, is resonating with people who were not necessarily big Biden supporters or Democrat supporters, because she's communicating well, truly well and truly what's at stake, and sensible, truth-based,
When I struggle with I don't struggle with it. I mean, I do struggle with it. The entrenched polarization of America. When I hear two people standing on stages talking about we're going to war with each other. When we fight, we win. We're going to fight each other. I'm like, well, maybe we'll get a few more percentage one way or the other, but I don't think it's going to do anything for the. We need to fight and then we need to heal. I'm like, oh, this is like hearts and minds and taking invading places.
Yeah.
It's
bad language, isn't it? Like,
really
aren't we smart enough to work beyond that? As a world, we should be problem solving based. We've got a lot coming at us, right? All the time as things change. We need to be ready for that.
As we wrap this up, where do people go for good, insightful market knowledge on investments and climate?
Yeah, Climate and Capital Media, and we do work with we partner with a lot of similar organizations. So one in Canada, a few in the UK, in Europe and the UK, which is Green Central Banking, which looks at the sort of pointy end of finance. Eth Invest, we do a lot of good information in our work around good impact investing, what that looks like if you're interested in that. And then the Climate Capital Forum, we look really at Australia. So what can we do here to make sure that we as an economy get the best out of the emerging clean tech world and net zero kind of market that's emerging? And yeah, we think it's an amazingly positive opportunity to be at the center of that global market, and we have that chance if we take it.
That was really wonderful. And just a reminder, if you're a CEO or a board member out there and you're interested in positioning yourself within those markets and going to these people, love to help out with your strategy, your attention, and your investment. So thanks so much for joining me, Blair. It's been a real pleasure. And I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Philip. It was great. Appreciate it.